the pregnant nun who created Protestant Germany, the love story that split Christianity forever. In June 1525, a 42-year-old ex-monk married a 26-year-old escaped nun in a small ceremony in Wittenberg, Germany. The bride had been living as a fugitive for 2 years. The groom was the most wanted heretic in Europe, with a death sentence on his head. Their marriage was considered scandalous, immoral, and an abomination by half of Europe. It was also one of the most consequential love stories in human history, a relationship that legitimized Protestant clergy marriage, reshaped family structures across half of Europe, and helped ensure that the Reformation would survive its turbulent early years. When we think of romances that changed history, we might recall Antony and Cleopatra, whose passion helped doom the Roman Republic, or Edward VIII, who abdicated the British throne for Wallace Simpson. But few love stories have had the sheer world-altering impact of Martin Luther and Katharina von Bora, a relationship that began with a daring escape, bloomed despite scandal and prophecy, and ultimately helped transform the religious, social, and political landscape of Europe. This is not a story of love at first sight or grand romantic gestures. This is a story of two people who found each other amid religious revolution, who built a partnership that modeled a radically new vision of marriage, and whose relationship provided living proof that the ideas Luther preached could actually work in practice. This is the story of how an escaped nun and a heretic monk fell in love, and in doing so, helped create the modern concept of the Protestant family. The nun who refused to stay, put Katharina von Bora, was born around 1499 into minor Saxon nobility. Her mother died when she was very young, and her father, facing financial difficulties, sent her to a convent. This was not unusual. Convents served as acceptable destinations for daughters whose families couldn't provide dowries for marriage. At age 5, Katharina entered a Benedictine cloister, and at age 10, she was transferred to the Cistercian Monastery of Marienthron in Nimschen. At 16, she took her vows and became a nun. Her life seemed set. She would spend her days in prayer, work, and contemplation behind convent walls, eventually dying and being buried there. For a woman of her era and class, this was neither tragic nor unusual. It was simply her designated role. But then, around 1521 to 1522, something remarkable happened. Ideas began seeping through the convent walls. Martin Luther's writings were spreading across Germany like wildfire. His 95 Theses, posted in 1517, had challenged the Catholic Church's sale of indulgences. But Luther hadn't stopped there. He questioned papal authority, challenged church doctrine, and, most relevantly for Katharina, argued that monastic vows were not biblically mandated and that monks and nuns were free to leave religious life and marry. These were revolutionary, dangerous ideas. But they were also intoxicating, especially to women who had been placed in convents not by divine calling but by family necessity. Katharina and several other nuns at Marienthron began secretly reading Luther's writings. They discussed his ideas in whispers, and they began to believe that they had the right to leave, to choose different lives, to marry if they wished. But there was a problem. Leaving a convent without permission was illegal. Nuns who escaped could be forcibly returned, imprisoned, or even executed. Their families could be fined or lose property. Any man who helped them could face serious legal consequences. Katharina and 11 other nuns decided to risk it anyway. The Great Escape on Easter Eve, April 4th, 1523. Katharina von Bora and 11 other nuns executed one of the most audacious escapes of the Reformation era. They contacted Luther, who was then living under the protection of Frederick the Wise in Wittenberg. Luther agreed to help, and he recruited a merchant named Leonhard Koppa, who regularly delivered herrings to the convent. Koppa had both access to the convent and a legitimate reason for a wagon to be present. The plan was brilliantly simple. The nuns would hide in Koppa's wagon, concealed among the empty herring barrels he was collecting. The smell must have been atrocious. These barrels had held preserved fish, but it was effective camouflage. Guards checking the wagon wouldn't look too carefully at empty, stinking herring barrels. On Easter Eve, when the convent was focused on religious observances and the guard was minimal, the 12 nuns climbed into the wagon and hid. Koppa drove away, expecting at any moment to be stopped, questioned, arrested. But the escape worked. By morning, the nuns were miles away, heading toward Wittenberg and religious freedom. The Catholic Church was outraged. An official complaint was filed. These were consecrated brides of Christ who had taken sacred vows. Their escape was both a crime and a sacrilege. Luther was blamed. He was always blamed, and the scandal added to the many charges against him. But Luther was proud of the escape. He even wrote about it boastfully, comparing himself to Moses leading people out of captivity. The escaped nuns became living symbols of Reformation principles, women who had chosen freedom over compulsory religious life. However, freedom came with a new problem. What were these women supposed to do now? The problem of escaped nuns. In 16th century Germany, a woman had essentially 3 socially acceptable options: daughter, wife, or nun. Katharina and her companions had abandoned option 3. Most weren't in contact with their families, who might be angry about the scandal, so option 1 was unavailable. That left option 2, marriage. But who would marry an escaped nun? These women had no dowries. Convents didn't prepare nuns for secular life with marriage portions. They had few practical skills for running households, and there was significant social stigma. Many people still viewed them as having broken sacred vows, making them spiritually suspect as marriage partners. Luther took personal responsibility for finding the escaped nuns' homes and husbands. He leveraged his growing network of Reformation supporters, calling in favors and making introductions. Over the following months, most of the nuns found situations. Some married, some returned to families, some found positions in supportive households. But Katharina proved difficult to place. She was apparently strong-willed and particular. She turned down several proposed matches. At one point, Luther tried to arrange a marriage between her and a pastor named Kaspar Glatz. Katharina refused outright, saying she would rather marry Luther himself than Glatz. This was probably meant as hyperbole, a way of saying anyone but Glatz. Luther was, at this time, still committed to celibacy. He had left monastic life but hadn't embraced the idea of clergy marriage for himself. He was also wanted for heresy, lived under constant threat of arrest or assassination, and wasn't exactly ideal husband material. But Katharina's comment planted a seed. The reluctant groom. By 1525, Martin Luther was 42 years old and had shown no interest in marriage. His friend and fellow reformer Philip Melanchthon described him as so absorbed in theological work and the chaos of the Reformation that marriage seemed impossible. Luther himself had said he didn't expect to live long enough to marry. The death sentence on his head made long-term planning seem pointless. But pressure was mounting from multiple directions. Theological consistency. Luther had argued that clergy marriage was biblically permissible and even good. Yet he remained celibate, which seemed hypocritical. If marriage was truly acceptable for Protestant clergy, shouldn't Luther himself marry? Practical modeling. The Reformation needed living examples of Protestant family life. How could the movement expect priests to marry and establish families if its most prominent leader didn't? Personal loneliness. Luther's letters from this period hint at isolation and weariness. The constant controversy, the threats, the weight of leading a religious revolution, it was taking a toll. Filial duty. Luther's father wanted him to marry and produce heirs. In a culture that valued filial obedience, this wasn't a trivial pressure. Meanwhile, Katharina von Bora was still living in Wittenberg, still unmarried 2 years after her escape, still needing a permanent situation. The idea of their marriage apparently came from multiple sources simultaneously. Friends suggested it. Katharina had, half-jokingly, mentioned it, and Luther began considering it seriously, not as a love match, but as a practical solution to multiple problems. In May 1525, Luther rather unromantically decided to marry Katharina. His reasoning, expressed in letters, was almost comically pragmatic. It would please his father. It would give testimony to his faith in his own teachings. It would spite the Pope, and the devil Katharina needed a husband. Notice what's missing. Any mention of love, attraction, or personal desire. The scandalous wedding. On June 13, 1525, Martin Luther and Katharina von Bora were married in a small private ceremony. Only a handful of witnesses attended, Luther's close associates who supported the marriage. It was kept quiet initially because the timing was terrible. Just weeks earlier, the German Peasants' War, a massive uprising partly inspired by Reformation ideas, had been brutally suppressed with tens of thousands dead. Luther had controversially sided with the nobility, writing a pamphlet urging the princes to crush the rebellion. His reputation was at a low point. The last thing the Reformation needed was its leader causing a scandal by marrying an escaped nun. But marry they did. 2 weeks later, on June 27th, they held a larger public ceremony and celebration, making the marriage official and undeniable. The reaction was explosive. Catholics saw it as confirmation of everything wrong with Luther. He was a heretic, a lustful monk who had abandoned his vows to indulge carnal desires, and his marriage to an apostate nun was mere concubinage dressed up in Protestant rhetoric. Some Protestants were scandalized, too. The timing seemed insensitive, given the recent bloodshed of the Peasants' War. The marriage to a former nun seemed to confirm Catholic accusations about the Reformation being driven by lust rather than theology. Even Erasmus, the great humanist scholar, made snide comments about Luther's inability to control his passions. Luther's close friends had mixed reactions. Melanchthon was initially upset, feeling Luther had made a hasty decision without consulting his advisors. Others worried about how this would affect the movement. The wedding was called disgusting, shameful, and evidence of depravity. Pamphlets circulated claiming Luther and Katharina were agents of Satan, engaging in orgies and producing demon children. None of this was true, obviously, but propaganda doesn't require truth. Into this storm of scandal and criticism, Luther and Katharina began their married life. And then something unexpected happened. They fell in love. The partnership that changed everything. What began as a marriage of practical convenience transformed into a genuine partnership, one of the most successful marriages of the Reformation era. Luther's letters after marriage reveal a complete transformation in his thinking about married life. The man who had married reluctantly, almost as a duty, became an enthusiastic advocate for marriage and clearly devoted to his wife. His letters are filled with affection, respect, and even humor about married life. He called Katharina my Lord Katie, or the boss, or sometimes my rib, referring to Eve being created from Adam's rib. These nicknames show both affection and acknowledgement of her authority in their household. He wrote to friends, "I would not exchange Katie for France and Venice combined." When traveling, he wrote her letters expressing loneliness and eagerness to return home. He publicly defended her against critics and insisted she was essential to his work. For her part, Katharina proved to be extraordinarily capable. She managed the former Augustinian monastery in Wittenberg that became their home, transforming it from a bachelor residence into a functioning household, farm, brewery, and boarding establishment. She managed extensive properties including gardens, orchards, and fish ponds, brewed beer. Luther was quite proud of her brewing skills, ran a boarding house that hosted students, visitors, and religious refugees, managed the household finances. Luther was terrible with money. Katharina was excellent. Supervised servants and workers, gave birth to 6 children while managing everything else, nursed Luther through various illnesses, participated in theological discussions at their famous dinner table gatherings. The Luther household became legendary. Their dinner table conversations recorded by students and visitors became the Table Talk, a collection of Luther's thoughts on theology, politics, marriage, and daily life that was widely published and read. These conversations revealed a marriage of intellectual equals. Katharina didn't just run the household, she engaged in theological debate, challenged Luther's ideas, and contributed to discussions. Luther clearly respected her intelligence and judgment. The model Protestant family. What made the Luther marriage historically significant wasn't just that it happened, it was what it represented and modeled. Marriage as a spiritual calling. Before Luther, Catholic teaching held that celibacy was spiritually superior to marriage. Marriage was for those too weak to remain celibate. Luther's marriage, and his writings about it, argued that marriage was a holy calling, that family life could be as spiritually meaningful as monastic life. Companionate marriage. The Luther household modeled a new vision of marriage based on partnership, mutual respect, and shared purpose rather than merely economic arrangement or producing heirs. This was revolutionary. Clerical families. Luther's marriage proved that Protestant clergy could marry and have families without scandal or spiritual compromise. Within a generation, married clergy became the Protestant norm. This fundamentally changed the structure of Protestant churches and communities. The priesthood of the home. Luther developed the idea that the Christian home, led by married parents, was a form of church in itself. The father became a priest to his household, but the mother was equally essential. This elevated domesticity and family life to spiritual significance. Women's roles. While still operating within patriarchal assumptions, Luther's respect for Katharina and her clear authority in their household offered a model where women had meaningful power and agency within the domestic sphere. This was more than many women had in other contexts. The children and legacy. Between 1526 and 1534, Katharina bore 6 children: Hans, 1526, Elizabeth, 1527, died at 8 months, Magdalena, 1529, died at 13, Martin, 1531, Paul, 1533, Margaret, 1534. Luther was, by all accounts, a devoted father. His letters about his children showed deep affection and grief, particularly when his beloved daughter Magdalena died in 1542. His writings about parenting influenced Protestant approaches to childhood and education for generations. The Luther household, with its children, guests, chaos, and love, became the model Protestant family. Visitors described scenes of domestic life that were utterly unlike the celibate, ordered monasteries or the formal noble households of the era. This was something new, a working family built around shared faith, where the minister was also a husband and father, where the home was both residence and workplace, where children were raised in a faith that their parents embodied daily. Katharina, after Martin Luther died on February 18, 1546, while traveling. He was 62. Katharina was 47. She was devastated. Luther's last letter to her, written days before his death, addressed her as "My dearest Katie, grace and peace in the Lord." Luther left Katharina everything he owned, which was unusual. Typically, widows received only a portion of an estate. This showed his trust in her and his desire to provide for her. However, the will was contested. As a woman, Katharina's right to inherit everything was legally questionable. What followed was a struggle. War came to Wittenberg in 1547, the Schmalkaldic War, and Katharina had to flee. She returned after the war, but found her property damaged and her finances in disarray. She struggled to maintain the household without Luther's income and support. In 1552, plague struck Wittenberg. Katharina fled again, but her wagon crashed into a ditch near Torgau. She was injured and never fully recovered. She died on December 20th, 1552, at age 53, having survived her husband by just 6 years. Her last words were reportedly, "I will stick to Christ as a burr to cloth." She was buried at the Church of St. Mary's in Torgau. The inscription on her grave marker simply identifies her as the wife of Dr. Martin Luther. How their love changed history. The marriage of Martin and Katharina Luther had consequences far beyond their household. Protestant clergy marriage. Their successful marriage legitimized clergy marriage across Protestant denominations. Within 2 generations, married clergy was the Protestant norm. This fundamentally changed the structure of Protestant Christianity, creating religious dynasties and integrating clergy into community family life in new ways. Family structure. The Luther model of companionate marriage, where spouses were partners and friends rather than merely social economic arrangements, gradually influenced Protestant family ideals. While full equality took centuries, the seeds were planted. Women's roles. Though limited by their era, The respect Luther showed Katharina and her clear competence in managing complex affairs provided a model of female capability that influenced Protestant thinking about women's intelligence and abilities. Education. The Luther household emphasized education for all children, girls as well as boys. This commitment to literacy and education for both sexes became a Protestant distinctive that had long-term social consequences. Economic impact. The dissolution of monasteries and convents across Protestant lands, a process Luther's marriage symbolized, redistributed enormous wealth and property, reshaped urban landscapes, and fundamentally altered the economic structure of Protestant regions. Cultural transformation. The shift from celibate clergy and monasteries to married ministers in family homes changed Protestant culture in countless ways. From architectural needs, parsonages instead of monasteries, to social dynamics, ministers' wives as community figures, to theological emphasis, sanctification of daily life rather than monastic withdrawal. The counterfactual. What if they hadn't married? Consider what might have happened if Luther had remained celibate. Protestant clergy marriage would have lacked its most powerful example. An advocate, Catholic critics could more easily argue that Protestantism was merely about breaking vows without offering positive alternatives. The practical model of Protestant family life wouldn't have existed. Luther's later theology about marriage and family would never have developed. Katharina's remarkable abilities would have been wasted. The table talks, recorded in their home, would have been very different or non-existent. Their marriage wasn't just personally significant. It was institutionally and culturally transformative. It proved that the Reformation's ideals could work in practice. It modeled a new form of religious life. It created a template that millions of Protestant families would follow. The love story they became. What started as a practical arrangement evolved into genuine affection and partnership. Luther's letters make clear that he came to love Katharina deeply, not just as a capable manager or mother of his children, but as a person he genuinely enjoyed and respected. The transformation in Luther's writings about marriage are revealing. Before marriage, his comments were theoretical and somewhat cold. After marriage, they became warm, personal, and enthusiastic. He wrote beautifully about the joys of married life, about companionship, about the pleasure of coming home to someone who knows you. This wasn't the passionate, consuming romance of poetry. This was something perhaps more radical, a marriage of equals within the constraints of their era, built on mutual respect, shared purpose, and genuine affection that grew over time. They bickered. Luther complained about Katharina's assertiveness, and she apparently scolded him for his health habits. They faced financial stress, child loss, illness, and constant public scrutiny. But they built something lasting together. Conclusion: the escaped nun and the heretic. In June 1525, an escaped nun married a condemned heretic. Half of Europe was scandalized. The other half worried it would damage the Reformation. Instead, that marriage became one of the Reformation's greatest assets. It proved that Protestant ideals could create functional, happy families. It modeled clerical marriage. It demonstrated female capability. It influenced theology. It shaped culture. And at the center of all these world historical consequences were two people who found each other amid chaos, built a partnership that worked, and came to genuinely love each other. When Katharina died in 1552, she was identified primarily as Luther's wife. But she was so much more: an escapee who chose freedom, an entrepreneur who managed complex enterprises, a mother who raised children in a new faith, a partner who enabled her husband's work, and a woman who proved that escaped nuns could build meaningful lives outside convent walls. Their love story didn't start romantically, but it became one, a romance built on respect, partnership, shared struggle, and genuine affection that grew over 21 years of marriage. And in the process, that romance helped create Protestant Germany, legitimized clergy marriage, reshaped family structures, and proved that sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply building a life with someone you've come to love. The pregnant nun who escaped in a herring barrel married the heretic who defied the Pope, and together they changed the world, one dinner conversation, one brewing session, one affectionate letter at a time. Not bad for a marriage that started as a practical arrangement to spite the Pope.